So I'm going to read from this alt-historical novel called Leading Men. It's told from the point of view of Frank Merlo, who was the partner of Tennessee Williams, as Ed already wonderfully set up, for 15 stormy years in the 1950s and early 60s. The novel begins in the summer of 1953, when Frank and Tennessee are living in Rome, and Truman Capote invites them to a party at his apartment above the Delfino restaurant in Portofino. And this is from Frank's perspective. Frank knew a drunk when he saw one. In a few years, he'd have good reasons to become one himself, to crave that slow, blurry kill. The night of Truman's party, he craved only the sea air, but for the air, he had to get past the drunk slouched against the doorway of the Delfino. From across the room in the low, smoky light, he might have mistaken the man for handsome, but as he walked toward him, into clearer focus came his pink, bloated face, his world-hating mouth, his body heavy and lifeless as a sandbag. Frank stopped to ask if maybe he'd come to the wrong place. "This isn't Portofino?" he asked. "This isn't Portofino?" A man appeared behind him and put his hand on his shoulder to steady him or claim him or both. "We are here for the party upstairs," the man said. "It is privato." "This is the party," Frank said, "downstairs and upstairs, not as privato as you think." "We drove from Firenze," he said. He put out his hand. "I am called Sandro. This is Jack Burns, the novelist." Frank had never heard of him and doubted anyone else had either. Truman's parties drew all sorts of hangers-on, parasites, wannabes. "The Gallery," said Sandro, "the great war novel, a great work of American fiction, and two just as great novels since." "Quit it," said Jack. "He is modest," Sandro said. "He is working now on his great fourth novel. I force him this weekend to take a break. I say, we go to the party of Truman Capote. We meet him in Firenze in June and last week received the telegram with this address. So I say, we take the car and drive to see the little man with the funny voice." "This place is lousy with writers," Frank said. "Claire Luce, Jack Dunphy, Tennessee Williams." At those glittering names, Jack rolled his eyes and swayed. "We going in or not?" he said, and headed for the bar. "Please forgive," Sandro said. "He has trouble with his book. He is a great man." Then he rushed to the great man's side. White yachts crammed the shallow harbor, their lights blazing, tinny music pouring onto their crowded decks. In Portofino, in midsummer, Truman's was not the only invitation to be had. It was even possible that these people, standing along the railings, talking and dancing in pairs, had never heard of Truman Capote or Tennessee Williams, not to mention Jack Burns, that they'd never gone to the theater or finished a book or attended the symphony, that they were rich without culture. Frank would rather be poor. He might rather be dead. He was too young, his body too tight, to be almost 31. Soon his skin will come loose from his legs and upper arms, and his face will dry to a prune. Who'll want him then? He had no money in the bank. 10 signed his meager paychecks. Though he'd gifted him a fat percentage of the rose tattoo in perpetuity, if Frank had learned anything in their 6 years together, it was that plays had shaky legs, and that perpetuity wasn't so long in the end. He'd had 10 walk-ons in movies in the 40s, but the last time he'd walked onto a movie set, it was as 10's secretary. They were in L.A. for the Glass Menagerie. Jack Warner had asked Frank, "And what do you do?" "I sleep with Mr. Williams," Frank replied, straight into the shocked eye of the millionaire producer. It was 10's favorite story. Just last week, he told it again to Anna Magnani. The two of them had laughed and laughed. Then he'd slapped Frank on the back. The slap shrunk him to the size of the dog. But they were right to laugh. Other than sleep with Mr. Williams, what had Frank Merlo done with his life? Back inside the Delfino, the crowd had thickened. He finally found 10 in the doorway of Truman's bedroom talking to the two palest, blondest women he'd ever seen, one of whom was holding a white Maltese the size of a football. "There's the horse," he said. Williams's name for Merlo was the little horse. That was his nickname. "There's the horse," Williams said, and grabbed Frank by the elbow. "These gorgeous ladies have me spellbound with the most delicious tale." He pulled them into a tight circle. "One is the mother and one is the daughter. I dare you to tell me which is which." Impossible, Frank said. They wore identical white iridescent shift dresses, the obvious mother in silver heels that brought her up to her daughter's exact height. They'd pulled their hair back in the same au courant style, which tightened the mother's skin almost enough to hide the marks of age. Bitte Blomgren, said the mother. Anya Blomgren, said the daughter. And this is Maya, Bitte said, lifting the Maltese up to Frank's mouth as if he should kiss her. Weeks ago, Bitte was saying they had come to Portofino from her sister's cramped Vienna apartment by way of their home in Malmö to stay with a widower of obscene and obscure wealth who'd set his sights on making her his third wife. He'd set up mother and daughter in separate rooms above the kitchen on the eastern side of his villa. The widower slept until noon, but the girls were early risers. Each morning, a local fisherman, a brute with a smashed nose and hook-shaped scars on his bulging forearms, dropped off the day's prime catch in the widower's kitchen. From their shared terrace, Anya, sipping coffee and reading a novel while her mother wrote letters inside, gave the fellow a little wave as he came up the walk. Then, another day, Bitte, leaning over the railing to admire the view while Anya bathed, wished him a buongiorno. His subsequent visits to their respective rooms were quick and rough and wordless. They had yet to determine which of them had him first. In fact, they were still unsure whether he was aware they were not the same woman. She would leave her door slightly ajar so that he'd find her sitting up in bed pretending to be caught by surprise. That was Anya. Or she'd stand in the doorway in her white silk robe, pull him in from the hallway, and rarely make it as far as the bed. That was Bitte. Bitte recounted these details with matter-of-fact directness, the briny smell that lingered on her skin, his oily, sunburnt chest covered in black hair coarse as wires, the filthy boots he never removed, his callous hands that sometimes bled, his animal grunts. She was bragging, trying to impress them. This happened all the time, around 10, spontaneous auditions. Frank believed little of it, least of all that this insatiable sea-wolf couldn't tell the two women apart. We men are connoisseurs of bodies. No matter how many we've tasted, they are as distinct to us as species of flowers. Our new friends have gone native, Ten said to Frank. It was the cook who'd betrayed them, according to Bitte, and the widower turned them out. Truman found them an apartment in town until they could decide on their next move. Money was not an immediate concern. For Bitte, the only concern was, who will we be? She was a painter who aspired to marry, Anya a model who aspired to act. Our country is dull, Bitte said. To live, we require brightness. We are mad for it. Anya's mother spoke for her the way Ten spoke for his lobotomized sister, Rose, as if Anya were too precious or limited to choose her own words. Frank wondered if brightness was indeed what Anya required, and if anyone had asked her, and what exactly it meant. In the hour or so that Frank stood listening to her mother, elbowing out the parasites, attempting to breach their circle, the only words Anya had spoken had been her name. That is, until Bunky, Truman's diva of a bulldog, entered their field of vision, and Maya leapt suddenly from Bitte's arms to greet him. The white puffball falling like a bomb startled Bunky, whose first instinct was to bite. Maya bit back, but she was no match. In the span of a moment, Bunky went stiff, bared her teeth, lunged, and took a big chunk out of Maya's side. In one motion, Bitte scooped Maya into her arms, turned her back to Bunky, and rushed out the door, her little dog whimpering and whelping and smearing her dress with blood. Sandro rushed over and dropped to his knees. Sono dottore, he said, and cradled the still raging Bunky at his side, which is when Truman appeared, hysterical, pushed Sandro out of the way, and sank to the floor. He lifted Bunky above him to inspect him, twisting him this way and that. Truman was so slight, so much a tiny creature himself, in his round glasses and floppy hair and flailing skinny wings. Not yet 30, he seemed far younger than Frank, a gawky child with practiced refinement and an alien brain. Where'd she get you, he cooed to Bunky in that impossible voice. His eyes and ears were all for him. She should be fine, Senor Capote, said Sandro, standing over him. There is no break of the skin. Thank you for this nice party. Who the fuck are you? Said Truman. Through all this, Jack remained out cold in the armchair. An assortment of twittering parasites then assembled around Truman and Bunky, rubbing Truman's back, scratching Bunky behind the ears. "We saw it all," they said. "We got here as soon as we could. Poor little Bunky, poor Truman." Frank and Ten rolled their eyes at each other, smiling. This was how it always was after entire nights apart. Lost in a parade of strangers and giddy acquaintances, they reunited in the final hours, faded into a corner, the faces and lights and music and clinking glasses becoming a silent blur around them, a brief intermezzo scripted for them alone. Soon someone would interrupt, lure Ten away, or they'd stumble home together too drunk and tired to do much but collapse on the bed still in their clothes, or they'd argue over some perceived slight and one of them would storm off again. But until then, for the brief time they found each other at the ends of these parties, they held one another's attention entirely, hungry for stories and kisses and gossip, as enraptured as they'd been on the porch in Provincetown the night they met. Two lovers locking eyes across a room. This was theater, yes, but it was something else too. Brightness, maybe. On that night, it was Jack Burns who came between them. "You see that guy I came with, Sandro?" he asked. "There was some excitement," said Ten, "of which this party was in sore need." "He's helping out a lady's dog," Frank said. "That sounds like him," Jack said bitterly, and the three of them set off to find him in the square. It was long past midnight, and crowds were still pouring steadily down from the hilly streets. In this way, Portofino was like the dozens of other port towns Ten had taken Frank to. People stood around with their ice cream cones, telling jokes and flirting and swaying to the music. Every once in a while, a startling burst of fireworks filled the sky over the fleet of boats. Then slowly, as the ashes fluttered away with their eggy smell and the yachts cut their radios, couple by couple peeled off and staggered back up the steep, narrow inclines, men in each other's arms, men with women, packs of friends, their songs and shouts bouncing off the stone in hollow echoes. The colored lights strung from the lampposts stayed on until dawn, when the guys setting up the fruit stands and fish stalls unplugged them and the boats whirred to life. That's how it was the night the six of them, Frank and Ten, Jack and Sandro, Anya and Bitta, and the patched-up dog, crossed the square to a nameless bar for a nightcap that none of them needed, and stayed so long talking, dreaming, planning, one nightcap turning to three, that the owner fell asleep, slumped in a chair, waiting for them to release each other. They emerged, squinting, into the second day of August, 1953, 10 years ago.